Greetings, fellow 632 classmates. This is Jon Kapell providing you a online reading presentation on Organizational Turbulence and Resource Dependence by Sheila Slaughter and Larry Leslie from Module 3. I'm going to provide some information regarding the article and the presentation at this point, so hope you all enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed putting this together. In providing a general synopsis of the reading, there's some good information provided here that it reviews issues of funding across post-secondary education and higher education over a 20-year period, specifically looking at financial trends in 4 different countries, being the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. It does a good job of describing academic capitalism being the driving force, or as a driving force, moving higher education into the global market, as we've talked in this and other courses regarding globalization being a kind of a trend that we're seeing, and that the world is getting much smaller with having many more people in it, with more ease of transactions and flow of information, and looking at the global economy as well, and in a little bit more of a competitive scale. This article strongly focuses on the resource dependency theory, as the authors use this as their guiding principle for the review of the various countries I mentioned. So I'm going to focus a lot of my time talking about the resource dependency theory, or RDT. The core theme for this theory is that it offers that there's general, otherwise known as block or unrestricted funding, is being decreased. Institutions within a national system or a comparable system, they're going to seek alternate sources of funding, both restricted and unrestricted in terms of money. So essentially, when money is being decreased from an overarching entity, educational institutions need to seek funding in other alternate means, and it's not particularly discriminatory as to where they look. It's looking at wherever they can find the additional funding. So this seeking of the alternate funding sources can have an impact on the nature of academic institutions' core work, and I'll go into more detail in this in a few slides from now, but I just want to put that out there as kind of a foreshadowing that we're going to talk a little about when you look for additional funding. Sometimes there is a hook at the end of that money. Going into the resource dependency theory themes, it's very important to understand a bit of a glossary of some of the terminology used. And first we start with relative magnitude, which looks at the determined by the shares of resources provided, meaning that where you're getting your money from. And if an institution is reliant only on one single sole source, then there is a heavy reliance on that source. So if there was a fictional school that were to say, we're only going to take state funding, we're not going to do fundraising, we're not going to take tuition, we're not going to look at raising money off auxiliary services, ticket sales from sporting events, or logo or trademark merchandise, we're solely going to be dependent upon higher education or the state to provide funding for higher education, then that becomes extremely reliant on that one source. That talks about the relative magnitude. We know that all those things I just mentioned probably would never happen. The criticality is that ability for the organization to function without that resource, and making that resource more critical in nature. When we look at educational institutions, we've got faculty and students which are vital because the academic mission is to teach and to be taught. And you can't function without those things, just like educational institutions cannot function in the absence of having money. So those being some very extremely important things to have in terms of having those resources available to us. With terms of funding too, there's both restricted and designated funding, and that's funding that's allocated that generally has a very specific purpose or has other kinds of limitations on how it can be spent. And conversely, we have unrestricted or undesignated funding, called sometimes block funding or general funding, which is allocated but does not necessarily have specific limitations to how it can be spent. It's a little bit more open and fluid as to how that money can be spent, so long as it's in alignment with the mission of, obviously, the institution, not necessarily the mission and dictated source of the funding. And lastly, human capital. It provides value, whether that be monetary or other, placed on people working within an institution and their ability to be productive, contributing members of that agency or institution, fulfilling the mission, goals, and objectives of the institution or of their individual capacities and roles in which they currently serve. So I thought it was important to have these terms to have a better understanding of where we kind of start with this theory. Some of the key concepts about the entire article as a whole, especially with the resource dependency theory, is that funding sometimes has a cost. And I don't say that snarkily. I say that as sometimes there's a hook. When you start looking at funding, as we get to the second bullet point, the shifting nature of the work in higher education can shift based on funding sources. If you're looking for a grant, that grant may have some expectations in terms of alignment of resources or alignment of research that to be conducted, and they want some specific research done, and you can only spend money on certain things that would facilitate that research to be completed. And as we look at this, one of the key concepts throughout the article too was there's a circular pattern that exists in decreasing block general funds and institutionally raised revenues, and that there's ebbs and flows. Money goes down, schools look for additional funding elsewhere, money comes up, they look less for money, but they're still looking for money. So it's cyclical in terms of nature in that respect. This reading is really important for us as doctoral students and as individuals looking at the critical eye of higher education, that it helps us understand the need to understand block or general funding versus other revenue sources, and looking at restricted, non-restricted funding. It also provokes a lot of thought about what happens and the implications of alternate funding sources. Again, going back to that grant funding, if there is a pharmaceutical company is looking to provide a grant, well, they're going to want some specific research to be done, and more than likely, I say the hint, hint, nudge, nudge, they're going to want you to find funding preferably in their favor regarding those types of things. There's also, the article as a whole allows for a comparison between the countries, and that's to a degree, to get a better understanding of the world of the market and educational funding. So the article does a good job in looking at those 4 countries, and I know I'm not spending a great deal of time looking at the actual results of those individual countries, but it was the resource dependency theory really resonated strongly as a dominant theme in this. In looking at some questions, some things for us to ponder, I will also put these questions onto the discussion board area for the site so that you have them without having to fast forward or to look for these inside this presentation. But my first question is, in what ways can colleges and universities continue to fundraise, yet remain available or remain able to argue for and demonstrate need and viable reliance on state-appropriated funding in times of diminishing allocations? Basically, how can we say it's important for us to have the state money, but we also need to do our own fundraising, and how do we balance those types of things? My second question is, when looking into grant funding specifically, how should one negotiate with a private source to accept their contribution yet remain unbiased in the outcome of the research to be conducted? And in what ways can this be ensured? And frankly, is this even feasible? So here's a couple of questions I posed to the group. I'm looking forward to hearing some responses. I definitely have some thoughts and opinions on these things, but I wanted to put this out there for you all to start our discourse a little bit about these topics. So I hope you all will contribute and engage in conversation on the discussion board at this point. And lastly, I wanted to provide the reference material by Slaughter and Leslie, The Academic Capitalism, Politics, Policies, and the Entrepreneurial University. So hope you all enjoyed this presentation, and again, I look forward to continuing and engaging in conversations with you all throughout this course.